Hey guys, let's cut a blank. If you saw my last video, you will remember that I told you I would do a video about how to cut your own custom blanks. So here we are. Now, in my last video, I told you that I had gotten footage of cutting that exact blank, but when I reviewed it, it was trash. So I decided to try again, this time using copper instead of aluminum. So as I talk today, I'm going to be talking about things like materials and ergonomics and how to do it and your setup and all the kinds of things. But as I am cutting in the video, as you're watching, I will leave notes up at the top to kind of draw your attention to what's happening in the video, since I won't be talking about exactly what you see on your screen. So hopefully that kind of a different format will help you get all the information that you need. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was the materials that you're going to need. Of course, obviously you're going to need some metal that you want to cut. And you could do aluminum, you could do copper, you could do brass, you could do silver. The benefits of using aluminum would be that it's the cheapest metal as far as practicing and learning goes. Copper is also fairly inexpensive when you buy it in sheets, and brass also. Aluminum is also the softest, and so that's another thing that helps you learn a little more easily. And brass, I would say, is the hardest one as far as like tensile strength, so a harder metal. And that also means that you're going to be breaking more saw blades than you would be if you're learning on aluminum. So if you go with aluminum, you're going to probably save on the number of blades that you need to buy as you're learning to do the cutting. The next thing that you're going to need is, of course, your jeweler's saw. So there are all kinds of them that you can find online. I started out with one that they call a German style. That is probably your cheapest bet. And you can find those on Amazon. Of course, I'll leave links in the description, like I always do for everything that's used in the video. A German style saw will probably run you $13 to $15 on Amazon, which is stupid cheap. And the thing is, you don't need something fancier than that. I upgraded to my new concepts because I was cutting so many by hand when I was doing my blank business. And I just wanted something that I felt like was going to last longer and did some fancy tricks. Buy a cheap saw. There's no reason to get a big expensive one with all the bells and whistles, unless you're really going to get into this and you want something that's just going to be like your best friend that you want to last forever. Just start with a cheap one. The next thing you're going to need is saw blades. So for the blade, they have little teeth that do the cutting, and those teeth only run in one direction. So when you insert that blade into your saw, you want to make sure that those teeth are pointing down. They're hard to see depending on what kind you purchase, so you can kind of tap your finger on the blade. Don't run your finger along it because you will cut yourself. These are very sharp. But if you kind of tap it with your finger, if you can't see which direction the teeth are running in, then that'll give you a good idea. And you'll want to put your blade into your saw so that those teeth are facing forward and down. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But the things to keep in mind about the blades are that depending on how much cutting you're going to be doing, you can buy, a dozen, or you can buy a gross of those. That's what, 144 or something. I'm not good at this math business, but you can decide how many blades you're going to need and how often do you break them, so maybe start off with a package of 12 and see if you even like cutting metal and then go from there. Another thing to remember is that the blades for a jeweler's saw come in different sizes. So the smaller the number, the smaller the teeth. The bigger the number, the bigger the teeth on the blade. That's important to keep in mind because the bigger the teeth, the more metal it's going to cut through with each stroke. That can be a good thing if you're cutting like a hard metal and you don't have a lot of intricate corners or anything like that, or tight turns, then it's nice to be able to cut more quickly. However, if you do have a piece that you're working on that has a lot of tight corners like this goat does, then you definitely want a smaller size blade with smaller teeth, or you're just going to like tear chunks out of like the goat legs. So you want to be able to use one that strikes a balance between being big enough that it's just not taking all day to cut a blank, but also small enough that you can do precision work. For me, that happy place is a size 2 blade. So as you can see in this picture here, a size 2 blade still will leave jagged edges. Like every stroke that you do, every time that tooth cuts through a bit of metal, it leaves a little bit of a jagged edge. That's going to happen with any size of blade that you choose. However, if you choose a larger blade, then it's going to make those edges more jagged and more pronounced. So maybe it will save you time in the cutting part of making a blank, but it will cause you to lose time in the finish work later on when you decide to file or sand those edges. Okay, the next thing that you are going to need is going to be what's called cutter's lube or lubricant. This is a synthetic substance. I don't know what it is, silicone or something. I don't know everything. Basically, you just rub that on the blade as you're cutting. And the purpose of that is to keep your blades from getting dull so quickly. It keeps the friction down as the blade is cutting, because of course, as you're cutting your metal, the blade is rubbing on metal and that's creating friction. It helps to lower the heat that is generated by that friction. It just makes it a whole lot easier to cut your blanks. The next item that you're going to need is what's called a bench pin. That's a little piece of wood with like a big notch cut out of it, like a keyhole. Here's a picture of one of those. And this clamps to your table or your workbench or wherever you're cutting your blank. And you rest the metal on top of that and turn your metal around and whatever. It's the thing that's holding the metal while you're cutting. The next thing that you're going to need is a pattern or a template of what you want to cut. So my favorite way to get those patterns made is I take an image and I paste it into a Google Doc, and then I crop it so that the only thing in my little image box there is going to be the actual image that I want to cut. Nothing extra. So I can use those little rulers at the top and side of the document to shrink or expand the image until it's the size that I want. So I stretched this one until it was 1.5 inches because I want a 1.5 inch blank. And then I can print that off and cut out my pattern and glue it to my metal. And that brings us to the next thing that you're going to need, which is glue. Now for me, when I'm cutting blanks, I prefer to use rubber cement, not just because it smells delicious, but because it helps to really adhere that pattern to the metal. So I've tried using glue sticks and other kinds of glue, and it does initially stick well, but as I've continued to cut the pattern and I would get to places like the hooves on this goat here, those little tiny pieces of paper that I need to stay put start lifting as the saw is kind of rubbing and pulling against them. Whereas the rubber cement makes it so that those don't lift until I'm ready to peel the pattern away from the metal. If you are wanting to be extra careful, and I highly recommend being extra careful, you will also want to have a respirator and some gloves. So that will keep the metal shavings off of your hands and out of your lungs. Okay, so as far as I can remember for a minute, that's all we need to get started. So the next thing that you're going to do is go ahead and set up for cutting your blank. When you're cutting out your pattern, you do want to leave a little excess paper just around the pattern around the image that you're using. And then you'll glue that whole thing onto your piece of metal. So I just use the tiniest little bit of rubber cement on the back of the paper, and then a tiny bit on the metal where that pattern is going to go. I let them dry for a few seconds, and then I stick it down onto the metal. The next thing that you need to do is make sure that you have your blade inserted properly into your jeweler's saw. So again, that means that you want those teeth to point forward and down. So if you're looking at my saw here, you want those teeth pointing to the front and down towards your hand. And then you want to tighten that up really well. The next thing that you'll want to do is just go ahead and check the tension on that. You can do that by kind of strumming the back side of that blade, and it makes a kind of a pinging sound. If you don't have it tight enough that it makes a nice high-pitched ping, then you're going to need to tighten that in your saw. Maybe I'll just have to do a short video later on about how to put a blade into a German style saw. Once you've got your blade inserted into your saw, you're going to want to go ahead and rub that cut lube on the tooth side of the blade. So just start at the top and rub it down on the blade, set the cut lube to the side. Now you're ready to cut. So some things to remember while you're cutting. You're going to want to make sure that you're sitting up straight. You want to make sure that your shoulders are relaxed. You want to make sure that your bench pin is sitting at about chest height so that you can use gravity to do the cutting instead of using the force of your muscles to do the cutting. So you're going to grasp the handle of your jeweler saw, and you're going to set the blade against the spot where you want to start cutting, and then you're just going to let your hand fall. And as you let your hand go down, that's going to grab onto that metal and start your cut. Then as you're cutting, all you have to do is lift your arm up and then let it fall. And you want to keep a pretty loose grip on the saw, and you can make sure that you're not hanging on to it too tightly by just looking at your knuckles. If your knuckles are turning white, you're hanging on too hard. Just move your arm in an upward motion and then let gravity pull the weight of your arm down. Just let the blade do the cutting for you. You don't need to be the one to do the cutting. That's the job of the blade. When I'm doing my cutting, I make sure that the left side of my blade is touching the outside perimeter of my pattern so that my blade is just right up against it. And then I can turn the metal instead of turning my sawing hand in order to go around corners or curves. So it's basically just like tracing. And instead of tracing with a pen or a pencil, you're tracing with a saw blade. So you just keep the side of that blade touching the outside edge of your pattern and you're good. As you're working, you want to make sure that your hand that is not holding the saw is really holding that metal firmly onto the bench pin so that you don't jump around and accidentally cut yourself or something. As you're cutting, you want to make sure that you're using the full length of the blade to do the cutting in each stroke. So you'll lift your saw up all the way and then let it fall all the way until it's touching the bench pin on the way up and on the way down, so that the bottom of the saw is coming all the way up to the bench pin as you raise your saw. And then as you lower your saw, you want the top of that saw to come right down to your bench pin, right down to that metal that you're cutting on. The reason for this is as we're cutting, it's creating friction. And if you're doing short little strokes, not only are you going to wear yourself out, but it makes it so that you have to use your arm and your muscles to do the cutting instead of letting just the weight of the saw do the cutting for you. As friction builds up on the blade, it increases the likelihood that the blade will snap. If you are using full strokes, that gives the blade time to cool and it doesn't cause the teeth to wear out in certain places. So maybe if you're doing short strokes at the top of your blade, then the top of the blade will be dull, but the bottom will be sharp and you won't be able to get an even cut. Also, if you're just using short strokes, that area that you're doing short strokes on, that's going to heat up and you're likely to break your blade. However, when you come to a corner that you're cutting, so maybe like on my blank here, when I cut in between the legs and I need to turn a corner, or when I come around the rump of that goat and I get to the tail and I need to turn a corner, instead of letting my blade move forward, I pull it back a little bit so that the part of the blade that is rubbing on the metal is the smooth side of the blade. So I'm not using the teeth to turn a corner, I'm using the smooth side of the blade to turn the corner. And when I do turn a corner, I do use just short little strokes as I spin the metal around, and that helps to make it so that those teeth don't accidentally cut into the blank where I don't want cuts to be. You're eventually going to come to a place on your blank where you're finished cutting and there's only a tiny little sliver of metal left, and your blade is going to be exiting the metal and freeing this piece from the larger sheet of metal. When you get to that point, you want to slow down your strokes and back off the forward pressure just a little bit so that your blade doesn't just burst through to exit that metal and bounce off of your bench pin or bounce off of your metal or something like that. Because again, these blades are thin and we don't want to snap them, and we don't want to cause injury to ourselves as we're cutting. Once you finish cutting your piece, you can go ahead and peel that paper off if you like, or you could leave it attached so that the surface of your blank stays protected from anything that might scratch it. So that's up to you. And then the final step in creating the blank is going to be to sand or file away any burrs around the outside edge, because as we saw, there will be some jaggedness to that. And if you're making this blank for jewelry or something, you're not going to want that scratching you. So you can use a nail file, you can use sanding paper, you can use a metal file. Whatever you find is the easiest way to go ahead and sand away those burrs and those jagged edges. And then you have a finished piece. So now my little goat has been cut, it's ready to sand and turn into something fun for somebody who is also crazy about goats. I hope this has been helpful for you. Cutting blanks is honestly really easy. It just takes a little practice. So don't give up on yourself and just practice if this is something that you're interested in. And hopefully that will clear up some of the questions that you may have had and help you to be a little bit less intimidated by cutting blanks on your own. If you want to watch another video about cutting blanks, Beaducation has a terrific one, which I will link to here. And if you decide that you don't have any interest whatsoever in cutting blanks on your own, but you do want some blanks that are custom, I will leave a link in the description to a shop where my friend cuts custom blanks. And you can contact her through her shop in order to order whatever shape you're thinking of. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.